One cheap pipe, paid for with a GI's pocket change, was bent, wrapped in rag, and fitted with a crude firing mechanism. It was nothing a weapons manual would recognize: a plumber's length of iron, a burst of propellant, a scrap of shrapnel lodged like a makeshift slug. A single shot, according to an oft-repeated veteran recollection, cracked through the still air of a freezing Belgian road and dropped a man, then a soldier's shout, and then a column's confusion. The story is told in mess hall whispers and post-war interviews. It is an unverified oral legend, a dramatized vignette rather than an archival certainty. Yet for the Americans who told it, for the Germans who were briefly stunned by it, that pipe was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. It was human improvisation against an enemy whose real strength did not come from individual rifles or from a single unit's courage, but from the ability, or inability, to move men, metal, and most crucially, fuel. A cheap pipe, a single flash, and the larger, harder truth: wars of mechanized steel are decided by gallons, by barrels, by refineries and railheads. The plumber's pipe, whether true in detail or not, points to that truth. December 17, 1944, a thin gray light pushed across the Ardennes. Frost rimed the hedgerows and froze the stumps of boot prints into brittle tracks. In the columns slicing through narrow Belgian lanes, SS panzer units, the spearhead of Hitler's last major offensive in the West, were supposed to be masters of momentum. Instead, they were a traffic jam of heavy steel, idling engines, and mounting anxiety. Radios popped with orders delayed by the snarl of vehicles. Men cursed at frozen carburetors and scratched the dust off fuel caps, only to find empty tanks. It was here, in and around a small village called Hansfeld, that a scene would recur in after-action notes in veterans' memories: the discovery of an American forward supply. Jerry cans stacked like small pyramids, wooden pallets of fuel drums, a reserve of high octane that for a German mechanized force felt for a moment like windfall. Some after-action accounts and veteran testimonies record the quantity found near Hansfeld as roughly 50,000 gallons. Sources vary, and the exact figure should be checked against primary reports. But the striking detail is not just the number, it is the reaction. German crews who had been cutting their ranges, siphoning from damaged vehicles, and hoarding seawater barrels to mix with rationed fuel, suddenly faced a pile of refined Allied gasoline. For a handful of hours, that supply seemed to rewrite the immediate calculus of the offensive. Engines coughed back to life, tracks were retensioned, men laughed and slapped shoulders. Hope, always brittle in winter, resurfaced. But hope was immediate and local. The battlefield that winter was governed by a scale problem. That cache at Hansfeld was large by German standards in late 1944, yet minuscule within the Allied logistics machine. To the Americans, it was an inconvenient extra. To the Germans, it was manna. This asymmetry, localized abundance against strategic scarcity, was a recurring and decisive theme of the Ardennes campaign. The German war machine by 1944 was hamstrung by oil. Years of Allied bombing, loss of key territories, and the limited scale of synthetic fuel output left Wehrmacht planners constantly juggling rations. Germany could not simply produce barrels out of thin air. Its refineries and hydrogenation plants were vulnerable and limited. Its access to global petroleum was cut. Men like Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and frontline commanders could point to factories and plants. But the equation was simple for any mechanized formation: no fuel, no movement. Tanks and trucks sit, radios stay dark, offensive plans wither under a frozen sky. By contrast, the Allied side possessed supply systems and industrial throughput that in aggregate overwhelmed isolated German windfalls. Logistics was not winged by mythology, but by what the United States and her partners poured out of factories, pipelines, and ports. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck-based supply network, ferried fuel and material toward the front in convoys that blurred into constant motion. Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean that had seemed a technical fantasy earlier, delivered fuel across the channel to keep the invasion forces fed. In other words, Allied warfighting capacity had been engineered not just at the squad or division level, but at the industrial level: refineries, tankers, and pipelines that together created a physical abundance measured in thousands and millions of gallons. Against that scale, a captured stack at Hansfeld was a helpful snapshot of the problem,
not its solution. The operational consequences were immediate and intimate. A German column that could see jerry cans and drums shining like a cache of treasure experienced the relief of refuel, only to face the logistical fact that refueling a dozen tanks for a single operation required more than what a lucky raid could provide. The Germans were forced into decisions that exposed the offensive's fragility: divert time to siphon and carry fuel, risk overextending supply lines, or press on without adequate reserves. Each choice chewed at an already strained timetable. A stalled convoy on a narrow road became not just a tactical hazard, but a strategic bottleneck. One disabled half-track, one jammed bridge, or one frozen ignition could create hour-long stoppages that multiplied into systemic delays. Against this backdrop, a small improvisation, a pipe turned into a weapon, acquires narrative cower, but not strategic weight. Imagine a young GI, cold and tired, seeing an enemy scout too close for comfort and jury-rigging a device.
The shot might have killed or frightened a few. A vivid, human story is born from that flash. Yet the offensive's fate did not hinge on whether a single improvised shot found its mark. It hinged on whether the spearhead could be fed the thousands of gallons it needed to keep the tanks rolling into a pocket of terrain and into the rear areas the Germans hoped to fracture. That is the larger frame the Hansfeld episode provides. It is where a micro story of improvisation meets the macro story of industrial logistics. If this kind of deep dive into logistics and battlefield consequence matters to you, consider subscribing for more maps, sources, and careful analysis. After Hansfeld, the narrative spreads outward. The Ardennes offensive, memorable and dramatic in its tactical ambitions, was also a study in brittle assumptions. German staff officers believed in shock and speed, a surprise strike that would cut the Allied front and seize ports. They counted on fuel, the assumed lifeblood of rapid armored thrusts. Yet supply plans were predicated on optimistic captures of Allied fuel depots, on securing quick lines of resupply, and on the ability to patch up damaged vehicles with scavenged parts. When those assumptions met the cold arithmetic of Allied logistics, the cracks widened. A single snapshot helps explain the mismatch. The Allies, by late 1944, were shifting millions of gallons through a web of channels. Tanker ships pouring petrol into liberated ports, pipelines spidering across newly won ground, truck convoys grinding north and east along prioritized routes. The Red Ball Express alone, a temporary logistical miracle, turned highways into rivers of tin and rubber. Drivers, many of them black soldiers in segregated units, ran round-the-clock shifts delivering everything from ammunition to gasoline. Convoys were organized with military precision: priority schedules, staging depots, maintenance hubs. Mechanized warfare required continuity. The Americans had invested in it. German logistics, by contrast, had been starved. Allied air power and interdiction attacks had thinned rail capacity. Fuel plants in Germany and occupied Europe were shadows of their wartime peaks. Synthetic fuel processes could not be ramped overnight. Even when forward dumps were found, distribution was patchy and risky. Captured fuel often required adaptation. Differences in octane or in the design of carburation could render it less useful without modification. And the count of functional fuel trucks and drivers on hand for a rapid redistribution was simply not comparable. Into that arithmetic walked human decisions that carried the weight of strategic choice. American engineers and officers often faced a hard question: if a major fuel depot risked falling into enemy hands, destroy it. That decision was not emotional vandalism. It was a calculated denial technique. Burn it, blow it, wreck the pumps. Better to see a billion-dollar resource traced into black smoke than have it reconstitute into the enemy's mobility. The most famous example of this in the Ardennes campaign is the deliberate incineration of fuel at Stavelot. Engineers, under orders, set fires, and the resulting conflagration produced a pillar of black smoke visible for miles, a signal to nearby German officers that resources meant to bolster their offensive were now gone. Captain John Brewster, recorded in some unit notes as the engineer who ordered depot destruction at Stavelot, was acting within a doctrine of denial. He and his men were trained to prevent enemy use of critical material. Their act, controlled, methodical, and grim, designedly transformed potential German gains into a landscape of ash and blackened drums. The visual image of tanks later abandoned amid smoke and heat
hatches open and crews walked away, became part of both Allied and German recollection of the campaign's collapse. The sight of smoke and the very idea that Americans would rather torch fuel than allow it to empower an SS thrust had effects beyond the immediate tactical. It cut into German morale. For soldiers who had been on strict rationing, who had traded batteries and cigarettes for a siphon of petrol, seeing their quarry burned by the supposed victors felt like a kind of psychological warfare. Testimonies collected after the war sometimes mentioned German astonishment at American waste. One captured non-commissioned officer, whose interrogation notes survive in fragmentary form, read the shipment manifests and could not conceal how surprised he was at the quantity and refinement. To German eyes, the scene resembled a perverse extravagance. This cognitive dissonance between the realities of American abundance and German scarcity had operational consequences. The SS spearhead, whose doctrinal doctrine depended on rapid refueling and forward momentum, now faced the prospect that even when they captured supply, the scale of capture would be insufficient to sustain an advance. The column slowed. Tanks that should have pushed to objectives found themselves immobile because of fuel allocation or because crews chose to abandon vehicles to save men for later. Commanders like Field Marshal Walter Model, who managed retreat efforts and defensive consolidations, were forced to juggle attrition and logistics in short cycles. In staff rooms and on icy roads, the question returned to the same arithmetic. Gallons in, miles achieved. The numbers were unforgiving. And the narrative of the pipe, of small improvisation, threaded through this arithmetic as a humanizing motif. It is easy to imagine a small scene, a GI bored with the tedium and danger of guarding a small dump, fashioning a weapon from available materials. The weapon performs one violent task and becomes legend.
But that single act could not scale, could not be multiplied into the thousands of gallons, the endless truck columns, the Atlantic tanker convoys. It remained significant as a story because it embodied soldierly ingenuity and the theater of war improvisation that arises when people must respond to immediate threats with whatever they have. That story explains feelings. It does not redirect supply chains. As the offensive stretched on, a pattern emerged. Tactical successes, day-to-day gains, and localized penetrations occurred alongside strategic depletion. German units took local fuel caches and used them to push for another day, but each tactical refuel bled into the larger problem. There were not enough reserves to sustain a broader campaign. Allied air power, when weather permitted, struck at depots and road movements. Allied interdiction choked railheads. Meanwhile, Allied logisticians, chasing vulnerability and opportunity, rerouted fuel to where it could stabilize the front and blunt the German impetus. There were other human costs entwined with these decisions. The campaign's violence included atrocity. The Malmedy massacre, a war crime that occurred during the Ardennes offensive, sits as a grim, factual marker of the campaign's brutality. It must be acknowledged as such, horrific and real. But it is not the primary subject of this narrative on logistics. Still, such events shaped battlefield mood and the ferocity with which both sides conducted operations that involved denying supplies, arresting prisoners, and seizing or burning materiel. The logistical choices did not excuse war crimes. They occurred alongside them in the full moral muddle of combat. Back on the roads, the phenomenon was stark. A German Tiger or Panther stalled for lack of fuel is a machine that transforms into something else. A hulking block of iron, a potential artillery target, a motor that no longer contributes to the offensive's momentum. Crews walked away from tanks in increasing numbers. Some abandoned because the vehicle was damaged beyond immediate repair. Others left crew and tank intact because fuel or recovery vehicles were unavailable. Photographs and veteran accounts capture those images. Open hatches, untouched cups of coffee left in tins, tow cables trailing in frozen mud. Each image is a datum in the ledger that logistics keeps. The Allied logistical machine did not stumble accidentally into supremacy. It was produced by industrial decisions and political choices that predated the Ardennes. American factories pumped out vehicles, engines, and fuel at a scale that answered the strategic needs of an expeditionary force. Ship convoys crossed the Atlantic under constant threat, but with numbers that overwhelmed interdiction.
Tank production and petroleum throughput operated as complementary functions. Supply demanded movement, and movement demanded fuel.
When the German offensive attempted to exploit localized vulnerabilities, surprise in terrain, timing, or weather, it collided with the reality that a mechanized theater of war was ultimately a contest of production and supply networks. This is not to minimize battlefield courage or tactical skill. Tank crews fought fiercely, infantrymen improvised, and commanders attempted bold maneuvers. But in a conflict where tens of thousands of horsepower needed to be fed daily, where armor mileage was paid for in gallons, the decisive ledger was held in depots, refineries, and pipelines, more than on any single ridge. The anecdote of the $9 pipe is useful precisely because it humanizes the calculus. It suggests how individuals tried to tip the local balance with the tools at hand. It also, quietly, points out how those tools are dwarfed by industrial capacity. There were further practical frictions. Fuel compatibility issues meant that not all captured petrol was immediately usable in German tanks. Different grades, contaminants, even differences in fittings could delay refueling. Trucks used for redistribution required drivers and maintenance, resources Germany was increasingly short of. Allied interdiction of rail and roads compounded these problems, turning a captured depot into a temporary windfall rather than a sustainable supply line. Orders to deny fuel, to burn depots rather than let them empower an enemy, were painful and controversial, but often militarily rational. The visual effect of columns of smoke rising over Stavelot and other burned dumps became a grim commentary on the wastage that war forces upon both sides. For the Americans, it was wasteful yet controlled. For the Germans, it was maddening and demoralizing. The decision to destroy rather than hand over a resource was a strategic act. Deny the enemy mobility and incur immediate material cost in order to avert a larger strategic loss. As December days folded into each other, the cumulative effect of these choices became impossible to ignore. Columns slowed, supply timetables snapped, commanders postponed objectives. Where early in the offensive, some German units had punched forward with the required degree of shock, the later phase saw a concerning attrition of movement. Tanks stopped, artillery fell silent, and the grand operational dream of a rapid thrust into Antwerp began to look less like strategy and more like a forced gamble against arithmetic. The story can be told also as one of perception. German troops who had cut their gasoline rations during a protracted war suddenly found themselves staring at stacks of Allied fuel and could not reconcile their scarcity with the enemy's abundance. That perception carried tactical weight. Morale is elastic. When soldiers who have been forced to improvise for fuel glimpse the volume of enemy stores, their confidence bleeds away.
It is one thing to surrender territory. It is another to realize that your enemy can literally afford to waste what you need most. It is at this juncture that the narrative must pause and consider two kinds of proof. First, the micro-level proofs, photographs of abandoned tanks, testimonies of men who emptied fuel drums into jerry cans by the light of kerosene lamps, interrogation memos noting the particulars of shipments found at Hunsfeld. Second, the macro-level proofs, production statistics, tanker arrival logs, pipeline throughput numbers, and doctrinal papers explaining the role of logistics in mechanized warfare. Together, these two scales of evidence build a picture. The battlefield was, in substantial measure, an outgrowth of industrial capacity. But even with such documentation, the pipe story persists. Why? Because people remember the small, sharp things. They retell the moment of ingenuity that punctuated months of hunger and tension. The plumber's pipe, whether it fired once at Hansfeld, somewhere else, or only in recollection, becomes a talisman. It is the human answer to an industrial problem. Soldiers make do, improvise, convert what is at hand into means of resistance. Those stories satisfy a psychological need to point to agency in situations that otherwise feel deterministic. As record and rumor braided together, commanders on both sides adjusted. German staff officers made frantic, often futile attempts to reorganize fuel priorities. American logisticians accelerated convoys and shored up pipelines, recognizing that the best answer to an offensive is continued movement of supplies. Engineers and truckers, a less glamorous cohort in conventional narratives, became the decisive force, the men who kept the convoys running, kept the guns fed, kept the tanks mobile, and ultimately shaped what ground was taken or held.
At the close of this segment of the story, the reader should see the contour of the argument. A vivid anecdote about improvisation opens the narrative and leads into a narrower, more consequential truth. The Ardennes was a campaign in which the arithmetic of fuel and supply trumped over time individual instances of heroism or skulkery. An improvised $9 pipe could matter in the instant. The pipes and jerry cans and pipelines decided the campaign's arc. Still, several threads remain unresolved. The exact fate of the SS Spearhead, known in some accounts by an officer reference as Piper, the detailed tally of gallons taken or burned at specific locations like Hansfeld and Stavelot, the precise production figures that define the Allied advantage, and the human stories behind decisions to destroy or deny. Verification of names, unit designations, and numbers awaits careful archival work. And the human scale, the testimony of individual soldiers who looked on while convoys rolled past or who watched oil drums ignite into columns of smoke, must be given voice in their own words to complete the picture.
What will follow is an examination of the operational choices made in the days after Hansfeld, how columns were rerouted and prioritized, how command decisions to burn depots were justified in staff notes, how German crews coped with the mismatch between hope and strategic reality, and how the Red Ball Express and Operation Pluto functioned in the narrow window that decided whether the offensive could be sustained. We will also look for corroboration in interrogation reports, in engineering logs, in the memoirs of men like Albert Speer and commanders in the field, to tie the micro stories to the macro data that decide history. For now, the image lingers: a cheap pipe, a flash in the frost, a soldier's small ingenuity. It is a compelling human frame through which to view a more prosaic but lethal truth. In modern war, logistics is not background, it is the main stage. If those who improvised at the sharp end of the spear are worthy of attention, so too are those who built the pipelines and kept the convoys moving. The plumbing of war, pipes of the literal and industrial kind, mattered as much as any pistol or tank. Sources and detailed citations for the numbers and names mentioned are listed in the description. If you want a dedicated follow-up focused entirely on the Red Ball Express and Operation Pluto, their organization, their daily throughputs, and the men who ran them, let us know in the comments. What followed Hansfeld was not a single seizure of fortune, but a chain of operational choices that exposed the deeper arithmetic of the campaign. Commanders on both sides recalibrated not by heroics alone, but by triage: where to send fuel, which units to strip, which dumps to deny. Those decisions, executed on icy roads, in frozen bivouacs, in the glow of truck headlights, made the difference between a local thrust and a collapsing spear. In staff cars and cold command posts, aides bent over grease-stained maps traced lines of fuel movement. A German regimental commander referenced in some post-war notes as Piper found his spearhead repeatedly starved. The name appears in fragmentary interrogations and veteran recollections, and it serves here as a reference point rather than an unassailable identification. In several accounts, an SS armored element that had pushed deepest into Belgian lanes became progressively dissatisfied with its prospects as fuel shortfalls mounted. The diaries and interrogation fragments that mention a leader by that moniker require archival cross-checking, but they capture a common pattern. The farther units drove without secure rear area supply, the less plausible their continued advance became. Rerouting was immediate and punitive. Narrow Ardennes lanes, single-track roads lined by hedgerow and culvert, could carry only limited traffic. When a column stopped, the line behind it accumulated. An immobilized supply truck might not merely be an inconvenience, it could be a strategic anchor. Allied staff officers learned to prioritize fuel convoys above most other traffic. Routes that had been planned for phased supply distribution were suddenly subordinated to a single demand: get gasoline and diesel to the units that could still move. The German reaction was predictable and desperate. Field rationing had already thinned their allocations. Drivers conserved what they could. Technicians cannibalized equipment. When a forward element did find an Allied dump, Hansfeld among them, the instinct was to siphon, to transfer jerry cans, to make temporary repairs and keep rolling. But those acts could not substitute for systemic capability. A column that siphoned enough to delay its collapse might gain a day. It could not, in isolation, restore the lines of communication and repair that an extended offensive needed. American doctrine, by contrast, had baked flexibility into supply at scale.
The Red Ball Express, for example, was a makeshift miracle of organization. Thousands of trucks, drivers working in shifts, priority schedules printed and enforced, staging areas where loads were transferred and maintenance performed. Within this system, fuel became a fungible good, routed, rerouted, consolidated. Operation Cluedo, a technological answer to the risk of tanker shortages, had created a pipeline across the channel that, while not immune to limits, ensured a baseline flow into the theater. The cumulative effect of convoys, tank farms, and pipelines was to make Allied tactical gains sustainable in a way German gains could not be. Numbers illuminate the scale difference, but they must be handled carefully. Accounts compiled from Allied logistical summaries and later scholarly synthesis indicate that Allied fuel throughput into northwestern Europe in late 1944 and early 1945 measured in the millions of gallons per week. Production and throughput figures are matters for primary source citation. Even modest errors in those totals do not alter the qualitative picture. The Allies operated with a margin of supply that allowed localized destruction and redistribution without catastrophic operational collapse, while German forces did not. In practical terms, when an American unit torched a depot, it was an inconvenience, rarely more. When Germans failed to take enemy fuel at the necessary scale, the result was a mobilization. The decision to destroy rather than surrender fuel became a grimly routine calculus. Consider Stavelot. Documents and veteran testimony converge on the basic fact that engineers were ordered to deny a major depot, and that denial produced a conflagration. That fire, its black billows and the metallic smell of burning petrol, was a deliberate act of strategy. Captain John Brewster is commonly identified in unit notes as the officer who authorized or supervised destruction at Stavelot. As with other names pulled from fragmentary records, the exact attribution should be verified against official after-action reports.
What is clear from multiple accounts is the effect. Engineers worked methodically. Pumps were rendered useless, drum tops pierced, accelerants introduced in measured quantities to ensure the goods would not be salvageable. They did not act in rage so much as in calculation. Destroy to deny. The visual consequences were immediate and demoralizing. A pillar of smoke rising over the countryside is not merely a physical marker, it is a message. For German troops smelling oil and watching flames, the sight implied a brutal arithmetic. Even when they closed on supply, sometimes their prize would be gone. The psychology of watching your hoped-for fuel turn into ash cannot be overstated. Combatants who had been preserving every last ounce now saw that to the enemy, some goods could be wasted with relative impunity. This contrast between enforced thrift and disposable abundance penetrated morale in ways that did not require numerical literacy to understand. A series of operational anecdotes illustrate how those calculations played out in the field. Small reconnaissance units would report back the location of a dump. A platoon or two could be dispatched to secure it. But in that process, the clock was the enemy. Loading jerry cans, checking compatibility, driving back along congested lanes, each step consumed hours that the offensive could not afford. In some cases, German crews refueled and kept going for a short period. In others, the effort required to redistribute the fuel rendered it effectively unusable. Where the Germans had limited recovery vehicles, towing capacity, and repair crews, even an apparently full tank could be a dead asset. Abandoned armored vehicles became one of the enduring images of the Ardennes. Photographs from late December show hulks half buried in mud, their turrets closed, their crews walking away. The reasons for abandonment were multiple: mechanical failure, battle damage, but not infrequently a lack of fuel. An operational commander faced hard choices: leave men with functioning vehicles but no means to recuperate them later, or abandon the machines to save manpower. Increasingly, the choice favored preserving lives over machinery. That calculus, painful and pragmatic, further eroded the offensive's momentum. A single tank left on the road could block traffic. A string of disabled vehicles multiplied the problem. Interdiction and air power amplified the logistics problem. When weather permitted air operations, Allied aircraft struck at moving convoys, rail junctions, and forward deposits. The Germans had counted on surprise and poor winter weather to blunt Allied air superiority. When skies cleared, logistical lifelines were exposed. The interdiction was not always decisive on its own, but it compounded the attrition effect. A convoy delayed by a ground jam, then pinned down by strafing, then finally forced to detour. Each layer of friction consumed time and fuel. German attempts to move fuel over long distances by improvised truck convoys further increased exposure. The result was a feedback loop. Shortages forced risky movements, which produced losses that deepened shortages. The synthetic fuel problem was a structural one. Germany's wartime petroleum apparatus had two central vulnerabilities: production limits and vulnerability to attack. Synthetic fuel plants, using coal hydrogenation and other processes, could produce substitute fuel, but not at the scale or flexibility demanded by a global war. Allied bombing targeting facilities and the disruption of occupied territories reduced throughput. Even when production was nominally intact, the distribution network to move fuel to frontline units was compromised by rail interdiction and a shortage of proper tank trucks. These constraints were not minor. They flowed directly into the operational ledger. No amount of local ingenuity could generate enough fuel to run an army of armor and motorized supply. That said, German engineers and drivers did improvise. There are recorded cases, often in fragmentary memoirs and interrogations, of creative siphoning methods, weakened mixtures, and jerry-rigged pumps. In such anecdotes, the human capacity to adapt is on display. But adaptation at the fringe is not substitution at scale. Improvise you might, manufacture millions of gallons overnight you might not. The human voice threaded through these calculations. Veteran recollections, American and German, reveal the lived textures. A corporal muttering as he unlatched a drum to pour into a jerry can, a driver counting the cans as if they were coins, a platoon sergeant estimating how many miles remained given current liters on hand. One captured German NCO reportedly described reading shipment manifests and quietly confessing surprise at how much fuel the Americans appeared to have in reserve. Such testimonies, evocative and occasionally contradictory, are the raw material historians use to humanize supply tables. They require care. Names and precise numbers must be cross-checked, but they underline a simple truth: logistics made moral as well as tactical claims on the combatant's mind. The question of compatibility, the technical fit between captured fuel and German engines, also deserves emphasis. Different grades of petrol, additives, and filtration standards meant that not all gasoline was plug-and-play for every engine. Sometimes recently captured Allied fuel required filtering or blending. Where German maintenance shops and crews were thin, such technical frictions turned potential windfalls into semi-useless booty. Drivers would sometimes report clogged carburetors after using unfamiliar petrol. Other times, the physical fittings of pumps and drums slowed the transfer process. These are the small headaches, when multiplied across thousands of vehicles, create systemic friction. As the offensive sputtered, German strategic leaders confronted an unwelcome arithmetic.
Field Marshal Walter Model and others had to decide where to hold and where to withdraw. The stubborn repairs and localized fighting were not in themselves the decisive factors. The macro evidence, production statistics, shipping logs, pipeline throughput, tilted the contest. Albert Speer, writing from the armament side of the war, later argued that production and industrial allocation were decisive elements in Germany's defeat. His reflections offer an insider's vantage on how factories, materials, and men are apportioned under crisis. Speer's memoirs and wartime communications are essential reading for anyone tracing the link between production and frontline effect, but they are also artifacts requiring critical reading and corroboration. Operational intelligence played a role too. Interrogations of captured troops and seizure of documents in towns like Hansfeld yielded fragments of the enemy's intent and capacity. American analysts could sometimes piece together a picture: which SS elements were nearest, how far they had advanced, what their estimated fuel needs were. Those estimates informed routing decisions. A brigade could be rerouted to intercept a fuel convoy only to find the enemy had moved elsewhere. In a theater of imperfect information, decisions had to be made on the best available testimony. One consequence of this constrained information environment was a tendency to over-interpret local successes. A captured depot might be photographed, cataloged, and celebrated in a unit report as a major win. Yet historians must parse report language. What was lauded as significant for morale could be nominal by strategic standards. The Hansfeld cache exemplifies that problem. 50,000 gallons is no doubt substantial in the horror of German scarcity, but it is a small deposit next to the flow of fuel the Allied machine could unleash. Presenting such captures without context produces an inflated understanding of their long-term effect. Throughout, the role of engineers and truck drivers, the miscellany of workmen who kept the arteries open, was central. Their work rarely features in grand narratives, but the simple mechanics of fuel handling, barrels hauled off trains, hoses connected to pumps, axles greased in the cold, kept the theater alive. In interviews, many who labored in these roles speak not of glory, but of routine skill. A broken axle fixed with a makeshift sleeve, a radiator patched with a cigarette tin, a convoy rerouted through a back road known only to locals. The impetus of war, on the logistical level, is a mosaic of such small, skilled acts. Now consider the fates of the SS Spearhead and its immediate environment as the campaign dragged on. Accounts vary, but the cumulative picture is one of attrition and denial. Speed lost its advantage when lines of supply frayed. Units that might otherwise have been dynamic became static. Their mobility diminished to the point that aggressive exploitation of openings became improbable.
In battlefield terms, the offensive lost its operational depth. Where a rapid thrust might have exploited a breakthrough, the lack of fuel pinned units into action that was short-lived and ultimately unsustainable. This was not simply a German problem in isolation. Allied commanders watched the same arithmetic and adjusted their own strategies accordingly. Rather than risk counterattacks into well-defended positions, they concentrated on maintaining supply and denying German recovery. In that sense, the Allies fought the campaign on two levels: the visible fight for ground and an invisible contest for the flow of materiel. The latter, more prosaic contest, proved decisive. The moral complexities of these choices are unavoidable. Burning fuel is not a matter without ethical dimension, particularly when civilians and prisoners could be affected. Orders to deny were issued within a legal and moral framework of military necessity. Still, the visible waste of precious commodities left some middling uneasy. In private letters and post-war memoirs, a few American soldiers admit to discomfort at watching thousands of gallons torch into the sky. On the German side, some veterans later testified to a sense of shame and confusion at watching their own supply possibilities evaporate. These human responses are part of the campaign's texture and must be included in any honest accounting. As the offensive's momentum evaporated, its operational narrative narrowed to retrenchment and survival. German units, pressed by lack of fuel and by Allied countermaneuvers, began to fall back. Some formations performed disciplined withdrawals, others dissolved into piecemeal retreat. Abandoned vehicles, empty fuel trailers, and the occasional burned-out depot testified to an operational collapse that had both immediate tactical causes and structural strategic roots. Returning to the motif that opened this story, the improvised $9 plumber's pipe, its symbolic value becomes clearer when placed within this larger frame. The pipe story is a human-scale window. Whether or not a particular anecdote precisely matches a recorded event, the idea of a makeshift weapon improvising against a mechanized foe captures something real about the soldier's experience, the perpetual resource gap between what doctrine prescribes and what reality provides. A single shot from a jury-rigged device could not turn the tide, but it could momentarily disrupt, frighten, or elicit awe. In the human memory, such moments densify into legend. They tell us how people on the ground perceive their agency. Legend and evidence can coexist without contradiction if the distinction between them is made explicit. The plumber's pipe serves as an anecdote, classified in this script as an unverified oral recollection unless corroboration emerges, while the industrial data form the structural argument. Both are necessary for understanding, the first to feel the texture of combat, the second to explain the outcome.
The final tableau of the Ardennes is thus a layered one. On one plane are the vivid, instantaneous human actions, improvised shots, acts of courage, small tactical victories and tragedies. On another plane are the quiet, unspectacular systems, refineries humming in the distance, tankers unloading at ports, men laboring day and night to route fuel through damage and winter weather. The two planes meet awkwardly in accounts from Hansfeld and Stavelot, where human improvisation collides with industrial might. Historians, analysts, and viewers must therefore do two things. First, they must preserve the human narratives, the recollections of men who made decisions under pressure, because these explain motives, perceptions, and the lived experience of logistics. Second, they must interrogate the structural claims with rigorous sourcing, production figures, shipping manifests, pipeline throughput logs, and official command orders. Only by bringing both scales into conversation can the story of the Ardennes be set aright. Several specific threads remain open for precise archival work. The exact tally of gallons seized at Hansfeld, the full production and throughput figures for Allied supply in the weeks around the offensive, and the detailed after-action orders authorizing depot destruction at Stavelo are all matters that should be footnoted and cross-referenced with primary sources. Names drawn from veteran memory, Piper among them, should be matched against unit rosters, interrogation transcripts, and German war diaries where available. Doing this verification does not undermine the core thesis. It strengthens the claim that supply and industry, not heroic improvisation alone, resolved the campaign. In practical terms, the Ardennes demonstrates a broader lesson for mechanized warfare. Material throughput is decisive. A tactical success can be ephemeral without the sustainment to exploit it. The war's larger calculus rests on the steady, often invisible flow of barrels, rails, and trucks. Victory is not won solely in sharp engagements, but in the corridors of supply that sustain those engagements day after day. The story closes where it began, with that image of a homemade pipe, a flash ringing out over a frozen lane, and a human act of improvisation that becomes a talisman. That moment, real or reconstructed, remembered or mythic, matters because it makes visible the individual within the industrial machine. It tells us that people do remarkable things with the limited means at hand. It also reminds us that remarkable things at human scale are not always sufficient to match the machinery of national economies. If the $9 pipe is a symbol, the real instrument of strategic consequence in the Ardennes was not a makeshift weapon, but the pipeline, the tanker, the convoy, and the factory. Those larger instruments dictated which columns moved and which stalled, which plans could be sustained and which evaporated.
When future operational histories are written, they should treat the human stories with respect and the industrial data with rigor. Only by holding both can we understand why a winter offensive that began with dramatic tactical promise dissolved under the unromantic arithmetic of supply. Acknowledgement. Precise figures and specific attributions mentioned throughout this narrative are drawn from a combination of archival summaries, veteran interviews, and later historical syntheses. Each major numeric claim, gallons seized at Hansfeld, Red Ball Express daily throughputs, PLUTO pipeline capacity, German synthetic production volumes, should be verified against primary documents. The Plumber's pipe anecdote remains labeled as an unverified oral recollection unless a primary archival corroboration is discovered. Where dramatizations are used in production, they should carry an on-screen notice identifying them as reconstructions based on veteran memory. The final lesson is sober. Ingenuity and courage shape moments. Logistics shapes outcomes. That is the way the Ardennes closed, less with the roar of a single improvised shot than with the steady, grinding arithmetic of barrels moved and denied, of pipelines that kept one side moving, and of scarcity that stopped the other. The Plumber's pipe, real or legendary, points us to that truth, a human spark illuminating the machinery behind it. Sources and fuller references are provided in the description. If you'd like a deep dive specifically on the Red Ball Express or Operation Pluto, daily throughputs, organization charts, and the men who made them run, tell us in the comments, and we'll follow up with a source-heavy episode.